Our last panel today is Maturing for Modern War, Lessons Learned from the Crisis in Ukraine. Who? By our moderator and the most questioned asker of the day, Mr. Sidney Freedberg, contributing editor for Breaking Defense. Sidney has written for Breaking Defense since 2011. He served as deputy director for the site's first decade, covering technology, strategy, and policy, with a particular focus on the U.S. Army. Currently contributing editor focused on cyber, robotics, AI, and other critical technologies. He has degrees from Harvard, Cambridge, and Georgetown. Let's give him a round of applause as he introduces his panel.
I can hardly operate the magnet on my ID badge, so it's good that I can operate the mic. I am Sidney Freeberg. Thank you very much for having me. It's rare I'm described as moderating anything. It's certainly not myself. So this will be a bit of a stretch for me to actually attempt moderation. But this is a really cool topic. We get to sort of see where the technical and tactical rubber meets the road. And lives are at stake, and matters of national strategy really get impacted by what's happening at a very granular level. There's a lot of fascinating stuff going on here, but not that alarm. As I said, I'm a master of technology. So I'm just going to launch into our first panelist, and we're going to trip down the panel. I think we're actually even in the right order. So I want to start with Samantha Lewis, formerly of IC jobs in DoD that she did not divulge exactly what they were actually in her prep call. I couldn't find the details on your LinkedIn page, but she has come out of the spy has come out of the cold. And now works heavily in the OSINT world with open source for recorded future. And she has a terribly boring title, but basically she runs their intel analysis unit that covers the four horsemen, right? China, Iran, the Democratic People's Republic is neither democratic nor popular or republic, and Russia, which is very relevant for today. And we were talking about open source intelligence. And we have this, the General Brett referred to this earlier, this enormously wired, ubiquitously surveilled world of drones and smartphones and, your ATM and credit card records tracing you wherever you go. There is tremendous potential for someone trying to make sense of the world in your field. There are also tremendous dangers. So how do you navigate that, especially in the context of this Ukraine war, which is happening in the midst of this surveilled, interconnected world?
Just a small question to start. I'm thrilled to be here with y'all. Really excited about this panel. But I think when we start to think about how we consider OSINT and how we consider intelligence, Russia's war against Ukraine has really established sort of a new ground, a new space. There's so much information online. There's so much available. I've seen, as Sidney alluded to, I've seen both sides of the coin, right? I've seen this at the high side and I've seen it at the unclassed level. And truly what is available from the OSINT space is remarkable. I have analysts who are in real time trolling the webs, making sure that they're collecting every bit of data. They're using the Recorded Future platform, the intelligence cloud, to get their information. And they're gleaning real-time, on-the-ground updates about adversary movements, which 30 years ago was a pipe dream. We have people who are sort of on the ground in Ukraine in live time updating about where adversaries are located. And there are OSINT companies and OSINT organizations, some volunteers, that are placing them on maps, right? You can in real time see where Russia is moving, where Ukraine troops are sitting, and you can pull it up right on your phone to check it out, right? We have folks documenting wartime atrocities on the ground. We have records being kept of things that previously might have been left hidden, right? And I think when we're processing this from an Army perspective or from the US government, the real question and the real trouble we're going to have, right, is are we prepared to fight in a world where everything is information and everything can be intelligence? My company stands for providing actionable, unclassified insights. And that means they're fast, they're shareable. Allies can receive this information and action it in real time. It means that every day, every time someone posts to social media, our people are watching it. And so when we start to think about how we would fight a war and how our people would be successful, some of the things we do really have to consider are we going to be able to move fast enough? Because this information is not slow. It comes out at rapid fire pace. And if you do not have people looking in the right spot, the adversary might be able to move faster than you. So that's one, I think, core component we need to think about here. And I guess just the other, which is interesting sort of in speaking to the Army, right? There was a really interesting example, I think, in December. We saw a Russian volunteer enlisted member who showed up to his basing station and decided to post a picture of it to VK, right? Standing next to a GRU member. And after posting that, we realized, not we, but the world realized, he hadn't turned off his geotag feature. Shortly thereafter, the Ukrainians bombed that Russian basing station. They killed a number of Russian soldiers. They debilitated a bunch of equipment. And then the guy sort of did the wrap up of OSINT's value in the public sphere by then posting pictures of it all, right? So real life battle damage assessments could be gleaned. And if that isn't sort of the life cycle of the information that's available nowadays, the importance of operational security in our messaging, and what was fascinating about the whole thing, right, is at the very end, even Russia, who is routine, they love to sort of underplay when adversaries get an upper hand. They acknowledged it and they said, operational security, right? This is really important. We're letting their perceived adversary of Ukraine win. And so I think if that's not the lesson here, I don't know what is. But I guess when we start to think about our conflicts, it's, are we fast enough? Are we looking in all of the right places? And are we considering sort of the breadth of information that's available? Because it's not just human SIGINT anymore.
Well, thanks. I mean, Colonel Stinchon.
Get your mic,
Oh, as I say, I am a technology specialist. Colonel Stinchon, you are still in, the classified world and also have a foot in the OSINT world. You have, I think, 26 years in uniform. You were recently the head of the National Ground Intelligence Center, and now you are on Army G2, if that's correct. So you are also dealing with, advising policymakers. Again, this huge amount of data on both the class and unclass sides. And yet the point you were making to me yesterday is, even so, we and the Russians and all sorts of people still can get fundamental things, just call them wrong. The way we were wrong about the collapse of the Afghan military, or conversely, the fact that Kiev held, didn't fall in 72 hours, hasn't fallen in 426 days now. It's something as, fundamental and kind of primal as you used to call it, the will to fight, which the general mentioned in our first remarks today. How do we get at something so important and so intangible? How do we deal with all this great information and still get things wrong that are such big, important questions?
Thanks, Sidney. I appreciate the question. And yeah, I think, I think the will to fight is really our first lesson learned here. And, if we look all the way back in the Wayback Machine, back to summer of 21, before this conflict started, where were we? We were in the middle of a deliberate withdrawal out of Afghanistan. And we are handing over portions of Afghanistan to our partners, the Afghan security forces, who we have partnered with, we have trained, we've given them all of our kit. And our assessment was that they would fight, right? They would hold their ground for the most part, right? Some assessments, and when I say we, that's as the Army G2, we're the one slice of the intelligence community, but that's the greater we. We assess that the Afghans would fight. potentially lose some ground over time to the Taliban. But we all know that's not what happened, right? So we had the Afghan security forces collapse very quickly. We saw the Taliban take over very quickly. We saw President Ghani flee the country. And then we all remember the tragic events in August with the suicide vest attack on Abbey Gate on HKIA. So again, we did not get that right when we partnered with these folks, with our Afghan security folks for 20 years. And I remember coming out of briefing the chief of staff of the Army and the secretary as we were providing those intel updates on the conflict and the withdrawal in Afghanistan, having kind of that discussion. And hey, did the IC get it right? Did we get it wrong? And then we literally blinked, if y'all remember, in the next month or so, we're seeing this build up, 80 BTGs, 90 BTGs, over 100 battalion tactical groups, on the border of Ukraine. And again, the questions to the intelligence community, the senior leaders are asking my team. I work for General Potter in the G2. What's going to happen? Well, we envision this kind of three-pronged attack into Ukraine, down to through Kiev and across to Kharkiv and to Odessa, and we're like, man, the Ukrainians are going to get smoked very quickly. This is going to happen very quickly. The Russians are going to come across and achieve their objectives, and that was our assessment. We got the Russian invasion part right, but we didn't exactly get the Ukrainians' will to fight right. Okay, and I think there's a lot of lessons here, but that lesson that the will to fight matters in a conflict is one I think we should all take away, and that is in a world where we are hyper-connected, sensor-saturated. We just heard from Samantha Lewis on all the OSINT and social media platforms and data that is out there at our fingertips, and we still got that wrong as a community, the Ukrainians' will to fight. But that's okay. That was a good thing that they had the will to fight. President Zelensky stayed, he led, he inspired, and we all know kind of where we are today. But I'll tell you, to kind of bring this back to a cyber and EW, since we're on a lessons learned panel here, the Russians also, right? Putin overestimated his capabilities to include his cyber and EW, right? He underestimated the Ukrainians' will to fight. And so what happened, right? So he didn't employ his maneuver correctly. He didn't use dismounts effectively. His folks were decimated in Kiev and had to withdraw, right? And he didn't plan from a cyber and EW perspective. He did not integrate those forces early on in the conflict. Not well, anyways. Certainly not with the plan for a months to year-long conflict. It was more of the kind of a short 3 to 5 day cyber instances, and he didn't really push his EW forces forward like he should have. So we saw that, right? We all know kind of where we are now. We're in probably, in my assessment, a very consequential point in the conflict with this Ukraine counteroffensive. We're watching that very closely. We'll see how things play out from here in terms of how this conflict ends. But yeah, I'll kind of pause there with kind of the will to fight. I think that's critically important that we all take that away, because what are we looking at next? We're looking at a potential. The NDS tells us that China is our number one pacing threat, and in a China-Taiwan scenario, that is also something that we need to watch very closely and assess. And I'll tell you, the IC is fundamentally relooking how they assess will to fight and how we apply that to China-Taiwan scenario. So I'll leave it there for now, Sydney. Thank you for that opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, Colonel. Now, Dr. Nadiya Kostyuk, for you, this is not just an academic matter, although you are academic because you're actually from Ukraine, although you've obviously been living in this country for some time. I think your personal life and work exemplify how interconnected we all are, right? This is not the 16th century where you send an ambassador out and a few months later you learn he was beheaded by the Khan or the Tsar. We have, this information space, cyber, electronic, cognitive, that the Colonel and Ms. Lewis were talking about is interpenetrating. You addressed this when we did our prep call the other day. Not just the uniformed military are fighting on both sides, not just regular partisans, but civil society groups. The Information Army of Ukraine, Anonymous, and international mega corporations, Microsoft, SpaceX's Starlink, are playing huge roles. distinctions, in practice, distinctions between combatant and non-combatant can get blurry, as we learned in Afghanistan and Iraq and in Vietnam before that. And borders are always clearer in theory than in practice, but this kind of world particularly blurs those lines as these ripple effects spread out. And you've done some work on that. So what is your take on what the lesson learned you see from Ukraine about that permeability and interconnection?
Thank you. Excited to be here. When you started with the czar analogy, I was like, I should leave this panel because I'm not going to be able to answer any of those questions. So you touched on two themes, right? So the first one was the role of the private sector in this conflict, and the second one is the borders and the fluctuation of borders. So I'll start with the first part. As Samantha mentioned, this conflict was unique, right? We've seen a significant involvement in from the private sector on a lot of different levels. Starlink obviously is very instrumental. We have cloud services were also super helpful at the beginning of the conflict, migrating a lot of important information out of Ukraine. Cybersecurity companies obviously provided significant threat intelligence, endpoint security, information sharing. I mean, there's so much where the private sector has contributed to hinder Russia's efforts in cyberspace. But the question that everybody has on their mind is something about how is this unique? Obviously, we know everybody had great stakes in this conflict, including a private sector, right? For them, this is a very important geopolitical situation with a lot of political, economic consequences. So the question, if we have similar situation in China, Taiwan, or anywhere else, will the private sector be willing to contribute and be involved as much in doing everything for free, right? I mean, let's be honest here. Also, like, is there something specific about Ukraine, internet infrastructure and resilience that, again, there was a lot of help from the Western partners, from the private partners, helped Ukraine build its resilience over the last 8 years since the conflict actually started in 2014. Again, is this unique situation can translate to China and Taiwan, right? We know that Ukraine's internet infrastructure is very decentralized, and so there are no obvious choke points, and that was another important factor that played in this conflict. In the situation of Taiwan, where we have sort of geography and there are some choke points that could be used, maybe it's not going to be sort of as successful as or maybe more complex for the private sector to get involved. So there are a lot of questions, and the answer is like, I don't know. Obviously, I think there is a lot of discussion in terms of, again, we know that private sector assistance is very, very important. And I know there's a discussion sort of between the US government, the private sector, what would be the next steps moving forward. But again, a lot of this was done very quickly out of, for free, which is an important deal here. In terms of borders, yes, borders are being fluctuated, but what is interesting and something that I'm studying, and I'm working with a computer scientist who use internet measurements, we can see that even though when Russia captures the territory, they try to establish digital borders, right? So we have these examples in Kherson and Zaporizhia where they try to reroute internet traffic through the autonomous systems that have been registered in Russia. And the main reason for this is control of information, right? Limiting the public access to information, providing their narrative, and making sure the public, believes that they are actually the saviors and the good guys in this conflict. So even though there is a lot of nuances that comes into this, but it's interesting how this, on the one hand, we have the erasal of all these borders, right, between digital and territorial, but at the same time we have the overlap and the establishment of the territorial control along with the digital control, because we want to make sure that information is fluctuating the way we hope for.
Understood. Well, thank you. And someone who's actively been on the ground in Ukraine 4 times, I think, since the invasion, as well as all sorts of other places, other time zones, especially in the Mideast, is our last panelist for the day, Vivian Salama, who has been with, I'm going to try to get all these acronyms here, ABC, AP, NBC, CNN, and now WSJ, Wall Street, the great, the well, that's the only I've been long told. I've been in the same job for 12 years. I've also been told the only way to get a raise in journalism is to change jobs. So someone is doing something right over there. But you have, been on the ground. You have also been talking, even recently to people, on the ground in the conflict. You were just mentioning, just the difficulty getting drones. That we have, DJI Mavics, these Chinese-made drones that both sides are using by the thousands, it seems. And, they're this great tangible example of, the electronic and the digital world creating this ubiquitous surveillance. And yet, they can be hacked, they can be jammed. And, especially the Chinese-made ones, God knows what's kind of exciting malware and spyware you buy when you buy those products. In the U.S., in fact, the U.S. Army blocked units from using DJI Mavics for small drone experimentation, I think a couple of years ago, precisely because of that concern. So, with that as just one case study, what are you hearing about, this vast buzzing ecosystem of the cyber and electronic information conflict that's on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, first, thanks for having me. Full disclosure, when AUSA approached me to be on this panel, I was like, I'm the wrong person. I'll refer you to others. And they insisted they wanted someone with frontline activity. And so I said, okay, I'm gonna try to do this. And then I sort of looked back at all my reporting and I thought, wait, I write about cyber all the time because it is such a dominant theme in national security right now. And it's something that where I don't consider myself a cyber reporter, it is part of our day-to-day, everyday lives. Everything that I cover touches on cyber. And the Ukraine war was no exception to that. And it was pretty astonishing because as someone who spent a lot of time on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan in the last 20 years, and, I saw sort of the evolution of how the internet and various technologies, cyber technologies, would go into these wars the way ISIS was using it and Al Qaeda was using it in the most primitive of days when this technology was first emerging, to now being on the ground in Ukraine, where you have 20-year-olds literally with airborne computers at their fingertips fighting wars. It is so mind-blowing to see in so many ways. And a perfect example, if you have not picked up the Wall Street Journal today, and if you do not have a subscription, then we're gonna have to talk afterwards. My colleagues Stephen Kalin and Isabel Coles did this amazing piece. Actually, I'll forgive you. You should go to the website to see it because there's a linked video, and it shows a Russian soldier in the trenches in eastern Ukraine pleading for his life through a camera from a drone. And I don't know if you guys saw this, but it just came out today, and it is absolutely mind-blowing to see where he's running back and forth trying to hide in one of the crevices of the trench that he was in. And finally, after hours of just bombardment from the drone, gave up and started pleading like this with his hands up, begging for the drone to spare his life. I mean, if that is not, it doesn't underscore everything we're here to talk about today, I don't know what is. And that is the changing face of how these technologies are being used. But even taking a step back, I mean, cyber warfare is not new. The Ukrainians will tell you we've been dealing with this forever, very debilitating hit on their grid in 2015, where millions lost power for 2 consecutive winters. Ukraine's neighbors have experience with this. I interviewed the Prime Minister of Montenegro a few months ago, and he was telling me about their experiences with this stuff. So it's not new. All the Eastern flank countries will tell you this is par for the course when you deal with Russia. But what was new going into this conflict is that the Ukrainians were better prepared for it. Remember, you were talking about a country that prides itself on being sort of this IT hub. They used so much of that skill that their people had, and I'm talking non-military, to be able to prop up their defenses, saying, this is something they've had to deal with for years now, and they were ready for it. And then secondly, of course, and I have Lieutenant General Barrett sitting right in front of me, the assistance from the international community, which came together in advance of this conflict, not just on sanctions, not just on weapons, but also on cyber defenses. And that was something that was hugely critical for the Ukrainians and was allowed them to be able to blunt some of the attempts by Russia to destabilize, to knock out their grids and conduct large-scale cyber attacks since the invasion. And we saw that in April of last year was a perfect example where the Ukrainians say they just barely were able to prevent a massive hit on their grid that would have taken out some 2 million people's power. And so that's sort of where we stand today. The drones, of course, are a whole nother issue. They're a fascinating issue, and they've been a highly contentious issue. I don't need to tell a room full of service members that the air defense issue has been a hot topic, and drones have been really critical to that. One thing that was really fascinating to me, being in Ukraine, having never really spent that much time on the ground there before this war, was just the vast open air fight, the theater that they were fighting in, where there was nowhere to hide. There was, the Russians were really good at building trenches. The Ukrainians were not as skilled. They're getting better, but they were not as skilled at building trenches. Some areas have forests, but for the most part, you're talking about these open fields of sunflowers and, rolling wheat fields with nowhere to go. And what was happening in the very early days, and it is improving somewhat, is that the Russians were able to jam whatever drones the Ukrainians could get their hands on, whether it was the Turkish drones or whatever. And still, the U.S. drones were not making it to the front lines as efficiently as they should have been. Most front lines had not seen a U.S. drone, even when we started sending a few in the early days. And so this was a problem. They didn't have the right anti-jamming technologies. Their drones were getting jammed. They didn't have access to the good drones. The high power, high quality drones that are being sent to them by these governments. And so they were having to go to the corner store and buy $100 or $200 Chinese drone just to be able to defend themselves in these open fields and be able to get any kind of advantage that they could. And so there I were, kind of full circle, going back to these 20-year-olds on the front line where they're showing me their Chinese drones. And I would say, aren't you worried that they're feeding the Chinese with all kinds of information about your positions? And he goes, I care about what's happening right now at this moment. You think I care about what the Chinese are looking at and how they're going to use that years from now? Their concern was staying alive and keeping their men on that line with them alive. And so it's a really complicated situation. And again, it all goes back to cyber. So, maybe I'm the wrong person for it, but it's a really fascinating topic and it definitely dominates my life. So I'm very happy to be here with you all.
Well, thank you guys. We could spend a whole conference on this panel, but I'm just going to try to grab a few themes that the general and you all have mentioned. I mean, it's I'm reminded of the very early days of aviation in the 1920s with Billy Mitchell and Dewey saying, once the bomber always get through, and once the new technology hits the enemy's cities, they'll all fold, versus the old general saying, no, the horse will dominate forever. And Army riding clubs are the only qualification for an officer. In the end, the World War II that we got was a very complicated mix of air power and ground power. And we're seeing this here in Ukraine again. There are these trench networks, as Vivian was saying, right out of World War I, complete with the West being not as good at digging trenches as the bad guys. The Germans had much better trenches in 1917. And yet all of it, this physical conflict, is overlaid by this electromagnetic conflict, which in turn is the medium for this digital conflict, which in turn affects the psychological and cognitive conflict that Colonel Stinchon was talking about, the will to fight. I mean, that's a huge question to ask, but I just wanted to go down the panel. how do those things interact? Is there a primacy among these levels where, yes, the new technology is the crucial thing, or no, the eternal principles of war are the thing, the human nature doesn't change, but the technology keeps changing? What is the biggest factor to look at? Is it the eternals or the new stuff? Is it the innovation or the ancient?
So I think to answer this, we're going to have to start with how Russia even thinks about war, right?
Mm.
So the Federation, right, it considers sort of three primary prongs when it's considering a wartime environment, right? It's got the kinetic field, and then it's got the information sphere, which has both information and cyber components. And Russia does not think about the conflict potentially the way the West has sort of traditionally, right? It's not just the kinetic and then sprinkle on some cyber. It's very much these three prongs need to operate in tandem. They all need to be active, and they're all part of this overall strategy. And what we've seen in Ukraine is interesting, right? Because I think at the beginning of the conflict, there was a bit of fun media sort of hype that said, this is the first time we're going to see real cyber warfare, right? And thinking like everything that we've seen with sort of NotPetya and the power grid attacks that were just mentioned, that was sort of what we were going to see here. And what was really fascinating is very quickly, right, after that 72-hour period passed and the armored columns north of Kyiv started to fall, and we noticed, right, that Putin had almost certainly overshot his competence, right? He had overestimated what his forces were capable of doing. People were surprised because what we did not see was sudden destructive cyber operations being able to overtake the battles. What we saw was the domino effect. When one component of this three-pronged system fell, that these other systems fell as well, and that the reliance on these other systems also increased. So what we saw, right, is conventional military failed to accomplish its strategic level objectives, did not capture Kyiv the way they thought they would, did not sort of seize the city and overturn the government. And right, we had Zelensky leading this charge to fight that was just spoken about, right? And in tandem with that, how do you as an organization or as a country then quickly adapt cyber capabilities and cyber targets to accommodate? Well, that becomes really tricky, right? Because if you're going to go into Kyiv, it's very easy to set your cyber targets and to figure out what systems access and what sort of degrading measures you're going to need to take to accomplish that goal. But when that does not happen, and suddenly we've got OPSEC problems and COMSEC problems, and your C2 is fundamentally flawed, and you can't even get supplies to the front line to move your troops, suddenly those cyber attacks and turning off the power grids is perhaps not as useful. And what we did see in that time frame too is Russia really shifting its emphasis, its reliance on degrading that enemy morale as a key priority. So we saw increasing in targeting that they thought was going to decrease Ukraine's will to fight. The targets had sort of shifted from the actual military targets to things like hospitals and to things like general power grids that were just going to leave families in the dark. Access to water was a key target, right? These are the things that sometimes you might not want to wake up in the morning and decide it's worth to fight if you don't know where you're going to get your food and your water and your energy. And it was interesting, right? Because this three-pronged approach, we thought this was going to be the cyber war of the century. It didn't turn out to be the case. And it also just emphasizes, again, that sort of domino effect. When your strategic planning for conflict does not go the way we originally intended, what happens to the rest of it? And again, that reliance on decreasing Ukraine's will to fight has been something we're continuing to see. The Kremlin has really surged its efforts in the information environment with mis and disinformation to compel the West to make Ukraine feel like it has no chance in the conflict whatsoever. And luckily, we're in a place where Ukraine is still fighting. They're still holding strong. Western support has been really unending to date, which is fantastic. But I think that Russia, we have to remember, they don't fight short wars, and they don't think about it the way we do. So this is not necessarily something that is going to be resolved in a month or 2 months. And generally, the very unfortunate part of the story is Russia's usually a bit more patient about this than we are. And so the question is whether or not we'll be able to sort of withstand the war in the information domain, which has become so increasingly prevalent today.
Colonel?
She said exactly what I was going to say. That was great. No, that was great. No, I think the shifting of targeting, between from the cyber to the kinetic, I think is an important point. Like you mentioned, we saw like Vivian said initially, this destructive cyber attack that attacked the grid that was unsuccessful. We saw over the summer continuous attempts to target the Ukrainian infrastructure. And when that didn't work, they went to the kinetic means, and you started seeing the barrage of missiles targeting Ukrainian critical infrastructure. Well, their critical infrastructure proved more resilient than the Russians had anticipated. And then they reached out to their good friends in Iran and said, "Hey, we need some more stuff. Get us some of those some of those one-way attack UAVs." So they started the kind of multi-axis, multi-vector attacks on Ukraine's critical infrastructure. Again, Ukraine's critical infrastructure withheld those sort of attacks. So they attempted it with cyber. They didn't, have a coordinated cyber kinetic strike, kinetic, non-kinetic, kind of in tandem to have mass effects. They kind of sectioned it, one at a time, and it was less effective. And then we saw them shift in targeting to, Ukrainian C2 and ammo supply points and some of their maneuver formations to try to degrade them in front of this, ahead of this, counterattack that we're seeing ongoing right now. But the bottom line right now, we're seeing, in the land bridge, that space between Russia and Crimea, where most of the fighting's ongoing right now. I mean, the largest defensive belts we've seen in Europe since World War II or even World War I, right? And it's going to take lots of bulldozers and engineer equipment, bridging equipment, mine clearing gear, tanks, dismounted infantry. It's going to take those types of formations and forces to breach through those defensive positions. But like we've seen in the last couple of days, weather has played an impact on their ability to maneuver and their ability to push ISR forward. So what's still available, to circle back to our first point on OSINT, OSINT's dynamic. OSINT does not get affected by the weather. OSINT is 24/7, and it can be actionable. So when you have forces forward and posting pictures and posts of the situation on the ground, that can give you great situational awareness to even geolocate and potentially support your offensive. So there's kind of a little bit of combination between the non-kinetic and kinetic and OSINT and how that's tied together, I think, in the current state of play right now. And I'll pause there.
Thank you. You mentioned that, Samantha, you mentioned that we are waiting for cyber warfare to happen. I was actually one of the few people, in academic, we always rebel. I actually wrote War on the Rocks, I think it was end of January, February, saying that it's not going to happen. Surprise, surprise. I actually was surprised by these claims. For me, it was the logic that actually explained in that article was, op-ed, I would say, was Russia has been in Ukrainian network system for 8 years. It has been doing all kinds of stuff. And now it places its military on the Ukrainian border. Why would we see cyber warfare, right? If cyber warfare tools were super useful or they're revolutionary, right? Sort of going back to your question, Sydney, they could have been used to substitute the military option. And obviously they were not useful. That's why they put the military and were ready to invade, which is, again, was very unfortunate and sad time for me to realize it. But this example goes back to the question of, with every new technology in academia, we have this debate, right? Is it evolutionary or revolutionary? Are we going to be seeing revolution in military affairs, or is this just evolutionary change and incremental change? And so far, took us, almost 20 years, 15 years for academics to realize that cyber is not necessarily revolutionary technology, is evolutionary. Cyber is good as an enabler. It's useful for to complement military operations, but it's not gonna just have sort of the same effect as military option. And that's what we see in the case of Ukraine. And the question that I have, right, obviously we've seen the few examples at the beginning, right, where there was some synchronization or complementary use, and there were a few exceptions in sort of in December or over the summer, right? We hear about some of the individual cyber operations, or I don't even know if I would say not necessarily meant to disrupt or destroy, but mostly I would say cyber network exploitations, right? When they would say, oh, we've seen Russian actor being in this electric power grid, and then Russia would follow with the military operation. The question is can we actually what is the value, right? What is the intent of being on those networks and system? Actually, are they changing Russia's ability to control the territory? Are they changing Russia's ability to hold the territory or to regain a new territory? This is, something that my research investigates, that I don't have a good answer for you. Hopefully in a month or two, I'll be able to answer this. But it seems to me that cyber by itself, it's not, I would say it's not there yet. The value that where I see the value of cyber tools is for information intelligence collection. I think this is the key, and we know that information in the current age can, potentially even result in the balance of power. We have seen how China has been using intelligence, right, to collect all sorts of valuable information. But cyber on its own in this conflict hasn't played a crucial role for me. And the reason, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to get, access to systems and network. Also, if you look at the even forces, right? Russia put 150,000 forces, at least at the beginning. And I don't know how big is how large is Russia's cyber forces. Or of course, we have some anecdotal examples, but can they that easily replenish, their, again, cyber forces, their access, etc., as easily as they have done it on the ground? Thank you.
So one of the things that I just want to add to all of this is that another big change for us as far as reporters go is the way we kind of receive a lot of this information. And it also kind of plays into this topic very, very much so, as far as misinformation, any disinformation out there that the Russians are extremely skilled at doing. And it plays a large role in this conflict in particular. And kind of looking back at my later years in Iraq, where ISIS was starting to use the internet to, post false pictures of them, taking over towns and doing whatever. And we would sit there in the most primitive ways, analyzing the pictures and saying, well, it's July in Iraq and they're wearing winter coats, so this is probably not really true. Something like that, where it was just an old picture or a fake picture, and they were trying to claim that it was a current event that was happening. And it was pretty primitive, and that was what we had to go by, and especially because we didn't have access to a lot of the areas where a lot of the events were taking place. Now the Russians have always been very skilled in this arena, but they are especially so now. And with artificial intelligence feeding into a lot of that, it's so hard for us, on the fly with the deadlines that we work with, and when we're in the field away from our hubs, to really be able to scrutinize and analyze a lot of the information that comes in. And so for us as media organizations, we are also having to take extra due diligence to be able to scrutinize a lot of the information that's on the internet, and it's not foolproof. I'm telling you now. I admit it. Like, it's not foolproof, and there's no absolute science to it. A lot of private companies, are very skilled at this, but most news organizations, do what they can in the time frame that they're able to be able to analyze information in real time. And when we go to the U.S. government, we ask them if they can verify a lot of these videos, but there are constraints to it. And so it really challenges everything that we do as reporters. And, this is a topic that goes well beyond just the conflict in Ukraine. I was someone who covered the White House in the last under the last administration, and we faced similar circumstances where we were always kind of battling information that we are trying to report versus things on the internet, and what is true, and how do we make people believe the authenticity of what we're reporting. And it is really, really hard to do. The false flag operations, the Russian use of the internet, and all modern technologies, including artificial intelligence, is just so profound that it is an ongoing dilemma for us in the news industry, and I'm sure for government officials too, who are trying to draw out tactical plans and are trying to figure out what the Russian moves are. And so that is something that I hope you all are thinking about quite a bit. It's definitely something that we all need to work on a lot more together to be able to kind of navigate that space.
That brings me to a question that Eventually, I'm going to get this. What brought you a question that you were raising, Samantha, which was, you have to do this fast. It's moving fast. You want to analyze this fast, but how do you avoid being fast and wrong? Well, it's because your human is, your 22-year-old intern is scrambling on 5 screens and, just didn't get it, or because your, supposedly trained large language model decided, the moon is made of green cheese because it was reading too many Reddit posts for its training base. How do you get it fast and right? That's something you try to do every day.
It is. And luckily, I don't have to deal with necessarily AI and or a 22-year-old intern scrambling to get my answers. So part of this, right, is about, at least for us, it's about the foundations of intelligence. Collection and the intelligence life cycle don't stop because it's OSINT, right? The way that we verify and we check and we double check and we question ourselves and we explore alternative hypotheses, it doesn't stop just because we're fast. It just means there's a lot of reviewers and there's a lot of line edits, right? And so part of this is about those foundations. Are we thinking about the intel question properly? Are we considering all of the alternatives? Have we checked the validity of our sources? Are we possible? Is it possible that we're wrong, right? And almost always the answer is yes. And so again, it stems from having good sources. It stems from having really inquisitive analysts who are okay saying that they might just not know at that moment. And then also just the last part of being okay with not necessarily providing an answer. And I will say, I served in government for years, and I sat in those offices where we were sometimes, forced to make calls. We were forced to make an assessment because someone needed it. The one really, really nice part about the job that I have now is we don't make a call unless it has analytic integrity behind it at all points, right? And that is part of my day-to-day job, enforcing those analytic standards, the tradecraft knowledge, the methodologies behind it. And that's not to say that we always get it right, but it does provide us a lot of leeway and leverage to make sure we can say, hey, this is what it looks like if this is true. And if that's not true, we're going to have to fundamentally sort of re-explore the potentials that we're talking about today. And I think that's really the basis of it. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that we're right every time. It would be impossible. But I will tell you, we usually get really freaking close. So,
I get it. Now, Colonel, let me ask a somewhat different question from you, as from your standpoint as a practitioner. You are an Army officer. You have people that you are, your first value inculcated. Take care of the mission, take care of the people. This is the question that General Barrett raised, in her talking points to us. Force protection in this environment where, like our Russian soldier who left his geotagging on his phone, we've had, the cases where people were wearing their Fitbits in Syria, right? And you could trace the exact outline of the base perimeter of the airfield, the classified location, because of people's Fitbits. People have families that post on social media, saying, Bob is deploying, or, Jane is deploying, or Bob and Jane dual military are both deploying, and, I'm taking their kids. You have this, we create these huge digital wakes, and we have these huge digital attack surfaces. You're as an intelligence guy, that's a feast for you, but from a force protection standpoint, that is a vulnerability. So how do you keep your people safe in this environment, besides turning off geotagging, which I think I actually managed to do on my phone, although I probably didn't hit all the switches?
No, that's a great question. I think that it starts with training at home and educating our folks, kind of what we're doing here today and at this conference, educating our young soldiers all up to our most senior leaders on good cyber hygiene, good OPSEC procedures, and kind of do's and don'ts in social media, right? That's kind of at one end of the spectrum. And then, fast forwarding all the way to the battlefield, looking really at your signature management and your emanations. And I don't think we do a great job of that. I think we're getting better as a community, but looking at the current forward line of troops and the frontline trace of the conflict right now, the battle ongoing across the electromagnetic spectrum is constant, and it's critical. And if you get it wrong, you're going to get targeted. You're going to feel the fire by annihilation on top of your head from the Russians. If you get it right, then you cause the Russians to expend more ammunition than they wanted to, and that's kind of what we're seeing. The Ukrainians have been very good at signature management, very good at electronic warfare, from spoofing, from some sort of deception and good OPSEC, and to protect their soldiers. Right, they learned very quickly. One thing that I was at a conference last year, and General Donahue talked about. The soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers are extremely technically and mechanically savvy. Think about all of the different stuff, that's a technical term, from all of our, U.S. systems and European systems and the different types of artillery and communication systems. And they are taking all of that, and they're doing a great job with in terms of learning how to operate that and to its max capacity in the battlefield, to include managing the electromagnetic spectrum. So I think there's a ton of lessons learned there for us as a community, for us to learn from as we look at how we fight and how our platforms on the battlefield of the future, from both industry to our Army leaders, and then again starting from on home base, just basic cyber hygiene. I think that's where it starts with every service member in the DoD. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
Yeah, and Dr. Kostyuk, let me extend this to the non-combatants in civil society. With the blurring of lines between, it's obvious that someone in a uniform with a rifle, waving a flag and singing, the Ukrainian national anthem is probably a uniformed combatant, and, an elderly woman with a baby is probably not. But, is a guy, a civilian who takes out his smartphone, takes a picture of a Russian tank and sends there are apps for this now, right? In Ukraine, you can send the geotagged photo that you take to the Ukrainian military, and they might call in a fire mission. Does that make that that Ukrainian civilian occupied area a lawful combatant, a spy subject to hanging? I mean, it's that these lines get really blurry. Is Microsoft an involved party? Is Microsoft's global infrastructure a legal target for the Russians? Or for the Russians may not care about legality, is it a target the Russians would be willing to go after in this war as they get more frustrated and more desperate?
Yeah, I mean, your question made me think about all the war crimes, right, that were committed by the Russians in the places like Bucha, right, when they were, when I talk about personal, it's not personal, but it's like I get sensitive, where there were a lot of young males, right? They were in their 20s. They took some pictures. They saw the tanks. They got not excited, but it was first few days of war, and they took a bunch of pictures on their phones, and they were posting on social media, not necessarily for the purposes of intelligence collections. And they obviously, Russian soldiers got them and killed them, and so it's obviously very very, very difficult questions. I don't have a good answer to this, but obviously there is, when it comes to the cyber domain, and obviously it extends to the general combat, like conventional military operations as well. It's there's a lot of discussion about what should be the rules of road, right? I mean, we have a lot of these discussions about cyber norms, and my colleagues, when it comes to cyber norms, they're like very skeptical. They're like, we're never gonna get anywhere. We're never gonna move on them. But I think what is this conflict showing is that it's so unique in its nature that I think we should be able to start making some progress and start defining it, because everybody is realizing that it's like very, very messy on a lot of different grounds, and also it could be easily misunderstood. It could be easily because of it all this could easily escalate, right? And so we need to have some clarity. I know obviously it will take some time. It would be difficult, but I think some hard choices should be made. But I I'm not the good person to answer this, and it takes time.
And lastly, I think we're almost out of time, but Vivian, sort of, you could bring us home with, you're in the business, right, of informing the public, as am I, although I have a slightly smaller readership than you. And one,
I think only my dad reads my articles, honestly. So
my mom
he does have a Wall Street
watched
Journal
at least part of the live cast earlier and said I was talking too fast. She did text me that. Russia, as people said, has going back to the Soviet days, has a long history of disinformation, misinformation as a weapon. And compared to ISIS or the Taliban, they're the masters. And yet, they failed to get traction. I mean, in some ways, it seems like they're more pro-Russian trolls, on certain U.S. cable news networks than there are actually on the ground in Ukraine, even among people who are Russian speakers. Is it just familiarity breeding contempt, or is there something went fundamentally wrong with their misinformation? The vaunted puppet masters of the Kremlin, seemed like the puppet strings broke this time. What happened to the misinformation campaign?
Well, I mean, it was like I was saying earlier, it's a combination of just like they've been at this game for ever, basically. I mean, the more over the past decade, they have conducted so many of these attacks on Ukraine, on other countries along the Europe's eastern flank, and they're used to it. Not just the eastern flank. I mean, we've seen it in the UK, we've seen it in the US. So, after a while, you sort of learn to expect it and try to adapt and try to kind of beat them at their own game. Whether or not Ukraine could have beat them at their own game were it not for the help of Western allies, then, the jury's out on that. Probably not. But they at least were ready for it. And it was like Samantha was saying, like, everyone was bracing for this. Everyone was bracing for this to be just this massive, massive cyber war. And because that was expected and the planning went into it, they were able to rebuff some of the consequences and potential, outcomes of that. But there's a lot to learn. The technologies change. The Russians are very good at finding ways around it. This. One of the things that I found really interesting, because all we were hearing before the war was about Russia's cyber activity in all these different countries across Europe, in the United States. Obviously, we talked a lot about the 2016 election here. And I would ask, officials and government all the time, why aren't we hearing more about attacks outside of Ukraine? Is it because they don't have the bandwidth to do that? And the answer that I get, and maybe some of you will contradict that, but the answer I get from folks is like, they don't want to provoke. They don't want this war to spill outside of Ukraine right now, or to make it seem that way. So the attacks that they used to do very blatantly outside of Ukraine are on the back burner for now, while they try to focus on Ukraine. We'll see how long that lasts, but it's been a really interesting space to watch, for sure.
Just a little parting note to keep everyone sleeping well tonight. Thank you very much. I think we are only 60 seconds over time, which for me is almost early.
That's not good enough.
So thank you very much. I will thank my panel. I thank you guys for being a great audience, and I will hand over to you as the master of ceremonies.
Thank you, Sydney. Let's give this team a round of applause.